there's always going to be a struggle over how to define oneself. It's good to keep broadening these terms.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and for you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
My name is Alex Aviña. I am an associate professor of history, particularly Mexican and Latin American history at Arizona State University. Let's see about my background. My parents are originally from Mexico. And they came to the US without papers in the 1970s. And I managed to barely make it. I was barely born on the US side of the border. So that's how, yeah. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today, I think. And what I do as a historian really comes from the struggles and the sacrifices that my parents went through to allow me to get to the position where I am today.
I am Conchita. My married name is Paula P, but I was born Conchita. I'm going to tell you the whole thing. Alex would appreciate it. And Lenny too. Concepcion Fabriciana Morales Gonzalez. 2 last names, 2 first names. So somehow, but my mother was Conchita, so I was named after her. And she was a big Conchita, and I was a little Conchita. No problems. And I was born and bred in Puerto Rico. I grew there and went to school there, graduated from high school. And at that point, I went to college in Washington. My father had been educated. I had gone to college and law school in the United States. So there was sort of was expected for me today. And I knew that that's what I wanted to do. However, that ambition did not translate with any kind of application to the language, English, that I was going to use. And the truth is that when I was 7th grade or so, somebody would have told me that I was going to spend the rest of my life speaking English, I would have jumped out of the window and get it done. My mother dragged me to every tutor she could find, but I just did not, even though I had heard the language a lot, in Puerto Rico you hear a lot of English, I just didn't have the desire. But anyhow, learned it I did against my better judgment. So enough that I was able to go and study at 4 years in college and then 3 years in law school. And after that, I married my husband, whom I met in law school, and he dragged me out to Akron, Ohio. And the opportunity to speak Spanish here just much less. There just wasn't available to me, So I do speak it. I have some friends, and it's always, I always say, it's just like eating candy. So, a very satisfying thing. And I don't know, Lenny, where your family came from in Puerto Rico, but I was born in San Juan, in Santurce, but I spent a lot of my childhood in Aguas Buenas, where my father had been born, in the mountains in the center of the island. And that, everybody assumes that I missed the beach that was 2 blocks away from my house. But no, what makes me homesick is those mountains, it's all that greenery. And I know that road that took us, and the property is still there. And I know that road, and I know it. I can sit in the back of the car and say, not yet, not yet, not yet. Oh, okay, there we are. The curves. And in that road that hasn't changed a bit. So that's my story. I never heard of Spanish Heritage Month, and much less September. Who invented it?
Yeah, so they started in the U.S. They started celebrating it in the late '60s with President Lyndon Johnson, and then it became signed into law in the late 1980s by Ronald Reagan. So now, because of that, we have this chopped up month from the middle of September to the middle of October called the Spanish Heritage Month that we celebrate on a yearly basis, right? And it happens to coincide with a bunch of Latin American countries declaring their independence right around the time of the middle of September. All the Central American countries, Mexico, Chile, and a couple others that I can't remember, right? So it fits well in terms of declaring. There's some controversy over whether this month should still be called Hispanic, and we can talk about that. But that's like the short little primer, right? So it started with LBJ, signed into law by Ronald Reagan, and every month now I get a ton of emails from people who want me to explain. I've gotten some emails that people want me to explain Cinco de Mayo during Hispanic Heritage Month, which is kind of hilarious. But so that's kind of like a short little primer as to why we have this month. And a part of the reason why these Latin American countries all declared independence around the same time in the early 19th century is because this famous French general named Napoleon Bonaparte decided to invade Spain. And that created this crisis of Spanish imperial authority in Latin America and its Latin American colonies. And throughout the region, mostly Spaniards who had been born in the colonies started to organize conspiracies to declare independence from Spain. And they took advantage of the crisis that was going on in Spain. And they all more or less did it around the same time, right, in September. And it was usually the same group of people in the colonies who were doing the declaring of independence. It was usually mostly urban criollos, right? Criollos refers to Spaniards who had been born in the colonies. They're mostly elite. A lot of them had served in colonial militias, and they're the ones who organized the conspiracies and declared independence. The one big exception is the country where my parents is from, Mexico, where there the independence took a much more radical turn, and you had this big indigenous mixed race and criollo movement that sought to expel the Spanish, led by priests in 1810 all the way up until 1815, 1816. Puerto Rico is a totally different story, right? And we can get into that as well, right? Puerto Rico remained after independence. Puerto Rico and Cuba.
Spain.
Yeah.
Until, and actually, they sent representative to Spain Spain was in bad shape. Spain was in very bad shape. A lot of political disturbance and whatever. But they sent Puerto Rico sent representative to the Cortes, and they actually came back with a very good deal, but it didn't do them any good because in the Spanish-American War, Spain lost, and Puerto Rico became part of the United States, was taken over as like the Philippines too. So that I had to tell you a little story. My father was born in 1902, and on April the 23rd, which is St. George Day. Well, his mother was very devout, and she had to name him the Day of the Saint because that was what was done. Except she didn't want anybody to know that she had named this child Jorge at St. George because they would think she was aping all these new Americans that had shown up 4 years before. So she made sure he was never called Jorge. So his name is Jorge Manuel Rafael. 2 middle names, you can't go wrong. His family called him Manolo always, except that then my father went to study at Harvard University, who wasn't going to deal with 2 names. three names today. All his professional life is under Jorge. All his familiar life was under Manolo. So as a child, I knew exactly when people asked me I knew exactly who they were. I could come home and I said, somebody you work with wanted to know how you are, or some cousin of ours wanted to know, because whatever name they used, I knew what side they were coming from. So, but and he was born in the mountains of in Puerto Rico. His father was a coffee grower, and he was more on the tyrant side. He died when I was 2, so I don't remember. Can you give us a brief history of Hispanic cultures within the United States? What are some of the largest Latino groups, and how did they get here?
Sure, yeah. So I think one of the important things to think about during the celebration of this month is to recognize that Spanish-speaking cultures have been around in what is now the U.S. before the colonists of the U.S., right, who ended up creating the U.S. So the city that claims to be the oldest city in what is now the U.S., San Agustin or St. Augustine in Florida, was founded like in the mid 16th century, right, and for well into the 1700s, a big chunk of what is now the US was actually under the control of the Spanish crown, all the way up from Florida to Georgia, all the way up to South Carolina, where they would fight these border wars with English colonists. The rest, most of the Southeast, Texas, the Western United States, places like New Mexico, Arizona, California, all those Western states were also part of the Spanish crown. Right, so what we could consider to be peoples and ideas that form part of this broadly defined Hispanic culture, they've been around for a really long time, even before the English colonists who later went on to create the US. In the West, the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico was founded in 1610, which is like the first capital that's founded in the US. I think like a year after Jamestown. I can't remember my year. Jamestown was like 1607 or 1607, I think. So these Spanish cities have been around for a long time. The Spanish language then has been around for a really long time. Also, something to think about as well is how we define the term Hispanic, and that's one of the controversies that is around today in terms of what does this term capture the heterogeneity of all the peoples that belong to this group, right? So we think about that, then we may have to trace back the history in the US even farther back, right? Tens of thousands of years to the original Americans, the different Native American groups and polities and communities who existed in this area for tens of thousands of years before the Europeans arrived. You also have African peoples who started arriving in the early 1500s when the Spanish colonized the Caribbean. You had African fighters who accompanied Hernan Cortés when him and 200,000 indigenous allies took down the mighty Aztec empire in the 1520s. And I think we just commemorated the 500-year fall of the quincentennial of the fall of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec empire. If we think about Asian peoples, they've been around since the 1560s, right? You had this Manila galleon that would traverse the Pacific Ocean from the Philippines once the Spanish conquered the Philippine Islands. These Spanish galleons would cross the Pacific Ocean, disembark in what is now Acapulco, that famous port city in Mexico, bringing goods, products, and peoples from Asia to what is now Mexico. And then if we even go back farther in time, what does it mean to be even Spanish, right? People from the peninsula. Well, we know that like Arabic peoples were in control of the Spanish peninsula for like 800 years, right? So what we think of Hispanic today also has a long influence, cultural influences from the different Arabic groups that controlled the Spanish peninsula from like 700s up until 1492. And we see that reflected in the Spanish language, right? So something between 2,000 to 4,000 words in the Spanish language today are directly tied to Arabic, right? So words like azúcar was sugar, or ojalá, which is related to inshallah. Sorry, go ahead, Conchita.
I said alcalde.
Alcalde as well, right?
Of
Alcalde.
course, in Spanish, that are A-L,
Yeah.
where they come from, you know.
Yeah, it comes from Al-Andalus, right? Which was this entity, this Islamic Arabic entity that was in charge of large parts of Spain for
700,
hundreds of years.
it's a long time.
It's a long time, and they contributed technologies like irrigation and farming technologies that then the Spanish took to the Americas. That's why sugar became a thing, right? It was these technologies. You also have a long Jewish influence as well. So Jewish cartographers, map makers, they're the ones who really helped create the maps and kind of like the navigation systems and technologies that then allowed the Spanish to cross the Atlantic Ocean, right? So this idea of Hispanic has all these multiple threads that go into it, and it's a really long story that goes back, as if we want to think about when the Arabic peoples went to the Spanish Peninsula about 700s. So this term has a very long history, and it's a heterogeneous group of people that then become part of it through different processes of conquest, of colonization, of empire, of violence. But there's also exchanges that happen within those processes.
Well, during the Reconquista, that the Christians tried to get rid of the Arabs. That went on for a long time, for a very long time. And they married in and out all the time.
Yeah.
So it was never very pure. It wasn't that you could say, these are the Christians in Spain, blah, 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 and these are the Arabs. It was very blended.
Yes.
Oh,
You're exactly right. Sorry, go ahead.
so in that sense, it's hard to say what group was fighting against the other group, because they would be fighting and suddenly made peace, and they necessarily, the Northwest probably stayed more than any group, the Northwest of Spain.
Yes, yeah, that remained kind of like the base from where they spread.
And that's the language, I think, that holds this together. It is, of all the things, it's basically the language. I don't think you're not going to be Hispanic or Latino unless you descend from Spanish-speaking people. And maybe that you didn't learn it because your parents didn't teach it. And I say that because I didn't teach my children, so I'm the guilty one. So, but it's the language that ties it. All the people that tie to that's the way I see it.
So Conchita is identifying the Spanish language as kind of like a connecting thread for all these different groups of people, right? And I think that is one of the most important ones, right? I think so. 1492 is a really important year, right? Everyone knows 1492 is when Christopher Columbus was looking for India and China, stumbled into the Americas. But it was also the year which the Reconquista was done, right? Like the Spanish Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella, they took over the last Muslim stronghold in Granada. And then they also started expelling the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. And then the final thing that makes that year really important is that this guy by the name of Antonio Nebrija put together the first grammar book for Castilian, which is what we now know as the Spanish language. And it's really interesting that he put an epigraph on the first page of the grammar book, of the dictionary. And in it, I'm going to paraphrase it. I'm not going to get it completely right. But the epigraph was something like, language is a companion of empire. Very clear, right? So language, then the Castilian language, what we now refer to as Spanish language, it was a companion of Spanish empire as it traveled across the Atlantic. And you had the extension of these, the slow becoming of something called Spain at the same time that they're conquering and colonizing these different regions of the Americas, or what we now refer to as North, Central, and South America. So language is really an interesting one. Language became a way to kind of exert imperial power. But at the same time, indigenous communities had to then learn that language then, so they could also use, the court system against the Spanish. And particularly indigenous groups in Mexico were known to be very litigious. They became expert practitioners of the Spanish legal system, right? Because they could use it to their advantage and they could win sometimes. I think religion is the other one, right? That's a big, complicated one as well. The role that Catholicism had, that was the other companion of empire, and essentially justified what the Spanish were able to do in the Americas, right? The Spanish were able to do what they did in the Americas because they had the blessing of the Pope, and therefore they had the blessing of Catholicism. And as long as they tried to convert indigenous peoples to Catholicism, their whole colonial adventure was there justified in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And that that you can imagine that produced a series of conflicts, but it also produced things like Mexican Catholicism, which is extremely syncretic, right? The Mexican Catholics pay a lot of devotion to the La Virgen de Guadalupe, the brown Virgin Mary. I mean, the image of it, if you take a look at the Virgin Guadalupe, like iconography, very clearly has European Catholic symbols and also Mexican indigenous symbols to produce something that is syncretic. And my parents or my mom especially is a very devout Catholic, but she wouldn't shy away from saying that Mexican Catholicism is like one of the most heretical forms of Catholicism, because by necessity, the colonizers and the conquistadors and the friars had to make room for indigenous religious beliefs if they weren't going to be expelled from what is now Mexico. And so Catholicism also has a very contested history in the colonial era. There's divisions between the institutional hierarchy of the Catholic Church, but also like how everyday people practiced it and developed their own folk Catholicism. And in the Mexican case, it helps spark the independence movement, right? So it's a really important, complicated thing.
But I was going to say, I was in California in a church, and I cannot tell you which church, but it was one of the ones of the Camino. So I'm sitting there with my daughter-in-law, and we're looking at this church, and it was fascinating because he had all the stuff that you expect to find in a European fabulous church, painted by fabulous artists, except that all the faces of the little putis, all those little angels, they were indigenous. I said, these were the locals. The Franciscans taught them how to do it, and they painted themselves on the ceiling of the church. And here they are. And it was just my daughter-in-law, who is not, this daughter-in-law had no Latin blood in it. She said, well, how wonderful. And there are all these little faces who are supposed to be the little angels, and they all look, and you know where they came from.
Yeah, that's a great example. You see that throughout Mexico too. There's one church, a colonial church in central Mexico in Puebla, where you have the same thing, where the indigenous artists did something similar to what you just described, Conchita, but the expressions on the angels are like sad or angry. So like that was their way of kind of inscribing their resistance to this model of evangelization that was in their eyes more authoritarian and coercive. But so even though there, a lot of people, historians used to talk about some sort of like spiritual conquest of a place like Mexico, it's hard to tell who conquered who sometimes, right? Particularly when the main icon of Mexican Catholicism is this indigenous brown Mary, right? So also I would say, because like I mentioned earlier, you also have some of the Jews who were expelled as a result of the edict by the Catholic kings and queens in Spain. Some of them came to the Americas, right? And they have their religious influences as well. You have indigenous religious influences throughout the region, and then African religious traditions, including Islam, that were brought by African peoples who were kidnapped and sold into the slave trade, who were forced to come to the Americas. So again, it's this really interesting, like you have multiple sources of religiosity and beliefs that I think it's important to highlight for the Hispanic Heritage Month as well.
I think that there are many of these communities different, and I think they would have to look at what is the dominant Latin people who live there. I mean, obviously, Alex is close to Mexico. That's what he comes. I come from Puerto Rico, so most of those people would be in New York and in the East Coast. I mean, this is sort of sad. I do remember the unbelievable immigration that happened when I was a child. Puerto Ricans, they left. And the question is here, why they left? They left for economic reasons. There was sugarcane was dominant, and they cut the cane, but you only work for 6 months. So the rest of the time they have so they left, and they left in droves. And my father loved airports, so we would go to the airport just for entertainment, to watch people come and go. And I remember my mother seeing those poor little Puerto Ricans who were leaving, and they wore their best clothes. I'll never forget that. But their best clothes were all very, very unsuitable to arrive in New York in the middle of winter. They had party dresses, the women, the men, and I just saw my parents, reaction and conversation. I learned a lot, and so for years later, when I was old and arrived at New York on my way to go someplace else, I always got a cap, and I look at that license to see what their name. And they all, I said, "Are you from Puerto Rico?" Yes, because in the 60s, they were all, there's the entrance jobs in a big city, is driving a cab. The last time I was in New York a few years ago, there was not one Puerto Rican cab driver that I saw, because they had moved up. Yeah. Economics, and they have moved up, and their children have gone to school, and they're professionals, and so there's a different group of people driving the cabs.
So I think one of the best ways to learn about, or to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, is to just learn about kind of the long histories of Hispanic peoples or Spanish-speaking peoples in what is now the U.S., but then also to think about why they're here to begin with, right? Particularly the more recent, because we took it way back to like 700s AD, but to think about like the more recent arrivals, like the community that Conchita's from, right? Like, so there's a great Puerto Rican journalist, Juan Gonzalez, who has a book called The Harvest of Empire. And his thesis about immigration, Latino immigration to the US, is right there in the title. Like he argues that Latino immigrants are in the US because they are the harvest of US empire. So if you want to take it back to the Mexican-American War, in which the US invaded Mexico, took half of Mexico's land, all of a sudden, a bunch of like Mexicans found themselves to be, at least on paper, newly minted American citizens. In practice, it was different, right? But in a place like New Mexico after 1848, Spanish was the main language, like the government language, for decades. So when we hear arguments about whether we should make English the official language in this country, we also have to think about moments in the past, in the history of this country, where Spanish in certain regions was actually the official language. And it was perfectly okay. Like, it didn't necessarily bring about the downfall of the US. If we go back to the Spanish-American War that Conchita talked about, right, in 1898, Puerto Ricans who then migrated to the US in the decades after that war, in which the US went to war for Spain, the US got the Philippine Islands, Guam, and Puerto Rico as colonies, and then maintained kind of like a semi-colonial hold over Cuba. Those folks came to the US as a direct consequence of US foreign policy in their decision to wage war against Spain. And actually from the first 15 to 16 years of the 20th century, Puerto Ricans had this status where they weren't US citizens, but they also were subjects of the US. And I think it was after 1917 was Puerto Rican citizenship. Yeah. But there was, at the same time on the ground, there was a practice of like outlawing Spanish or outlawing the Puerto Rican flag.
I would like to say the Puerto Ricans volunteer in the army for the first war and second wars in unbelievable numbers,
Yep.
considering this little island.
Yep.
And that is well, this is a little digression, but I went to see the wall after Vietnam because I happened to be in Washington right after it went up. And I stood there shocked.
Yeah.
With high proportion of Spanish names. I knew not some of them Puerto Rican, some of them were Mexican, some of them whatever, but the number just is so high.
Yeah.
I went to look for a cousin of my husband who had arrived there and died probably on the second day. And you know, I found that name, and you know, and I it's very sad because I knew his mother and parents. But anyhow, but after I had him, I just went around looking everywhere I looked, and there were more, you know, the Spanish name. And of course, some of them, maybe they were, and they didn't have the right name. I mean, you understand, they have, like my children, who do not have a last name that, so that was, people forget that.
Yeah, that's really important. There was, I think, what, like 56,000 people were killed in Vietnam, soldiers. Like 6 out of 10 were either Black or Latino.
You know, well, that was it. Well, I stood there, I'm getting like that. And I said, oh my God, I've just counted the Spanish name, but I have no idea how many of these names are Black people.
Yeah.
You know, they lost this thing.
Each wave of migrants that have come into the US since the 19th century has faced hostility from the dominant population in the US, right? And as each of these groups becomes like assimilated, their threat goes away, right? So the Irish, the Italians, or Jewish Americans. The thing about Latino populations who have come to the US primarily, again, as a result of what US foreign policy is doing elsewhere, is the question of assimilation is what tends to freak like white Americans out, right? The fact that you have Mexican communities in the Southwest, or now everywhere in the US, or you have Puerto Rican communities and neighborhoods in Chicago or New York that still want to proudly display that identity, will then lead some people to say, well, they're not assimilated, therefore they're somehow dangerous or a threat to this idea that is the United States. And I think one way we can address that is to personalize these stories of why people come here to begin with, like to humanize stories of why Latin Americans or Latinos come to this country historically and currently. To think about how, you know, for me, it's a very personal issue because my parents came here as undocumented migrants in the 70s. And the reasons why they came are the same reasons that Conchita described earlier. They came here for economic opportunity. And ironically, the goal, it wasn't a permanent plan. It was to make some dollars here and then go back to Mexico. And this is like an overwhelming feeling, at least amongst Mexican migrants. Ironically, US immigration policy since the 80s have tended to militarize the border. They've actually made it harder for people to go back to Mexico. And that's why people stay. And that's what happened to my parents. So I think we need to humanize these stories of why these people came here to begin with. They're here for economic opportunity. They're here just to live. They're here trying to create a life of dignity and progress and education for their kid. My parents were really big on education. They wanted to give us an opportunity at obtaining an education. My dad only has 1 year of formal education. My mom has 5. So they knew the value of education because they simply didn't have it. My grandfather, I think both of my grandfathers died illiterate, right? So they knew that education was an important, potent tool to grow as people, not just for economic opportunity. So I think if we can humanize the stories of why these folks are here, what they're fleeing, why they're forced to flee their homelands, to come here. And when they come here, they're not here to take jobs. They're not here to reconquer the Southwest, as some people, some far right activists in Arizona like to talk about. They're here to try to create a dignified life for themselves and their families. They're not here to undermine the US. They're not here to overthrow the US government. They're just trying to live. And I think that's something to keep in mind when we think about Hispanic Heritage Month, is to connect why these people are leaving their homelands, usually related, again, going back to Juan Gonzalez's book, usually related to some aspect of US empire, right? So in that, we should think about the responsibility that the US government has. So we've heard a lot about Central American migrants coming since the early 2010s. They're coming here as a direct consequence of what was happening in their countries in the 70s and 80s, when the official US foreign policy was to support horrific death squad regimes and military dictators. And people fled as refugees. They were trying to escape that, and they were trying to make it to the US. So there has to be, on some level, I think, a recognition that at the US government level, there has to be a recognition that this is something about fairness and equity, and that both things are connected. But the bottom level for me is to humanize these stories and to just really get the idea out there that these people here are just trying to make a living. They're here to live. They're looking for dignity. They're looking for the opportunity to give their kids the best possible shot at life. The best way to commemorate this month is to just learn. And for me, I would say read as much as possible. Read people like, to bring up Juan Gonzalez again, his book, Harvest of Empire, is amazing. It's accessible. I had a great colleague when I was in graduate school. She's now a professor at Princeton, Rosina Lozano. She has a history of the Spanish language in the US. It's called an American language. It's a really good history of how long Spanish, the language, has been in the US. There's all sorts of great fiction. You could read, I think the last book that I read that was quasi-fiction was this book called The Lost Children Archive, which is by Valeria Luiselli, who talks about migrants, and especially young migrants who are trying to cross the border and humanizing their struggles. And there's just all sorts of greats. I don't know. I mean, how long do you want it? You can read the great Chilean poetess, Gabriela Mistral. We can read Isabel Allende, the Chilean novelist. Music, there's all sorts of great music. I would say since you guys are both Puerto Rican, I'll just say listen to Calle 13, listen to Celso Piña, Ana Tijoux, Susana Baca, Chavela Vargas. It's just, I think, just to learn as much as possible and not to, I don't know if you guys have noticed when you watch a movie about Mexico or Latin America, the filter that movie makers use changes, so it becomes like sepia and it looks like this ominous place. Like, I think reading and watching documentaries and listening to music is a way to kind of get those sepia filters out of the way. So a place like a region like Latin America doesn't seem to be this scary place. And maybe that will help then change attitudes about Latin Americans and Latino peoples coming to the US.
I think that the music, I think it goes back to language, because there's such a vivid and strong strain of literary production, old and present, and it just doesn't ever go away. And it's always best in the original. It's hard to translations. You remember? Oh God, I could forget this story. There's a book by. Okay, I could never understand why somebody would read this in English. I have a brother-in-law, and he was reading this book as a translation. I said, "How can you read this?" And I said, those things don't happen in English. See, you know what the name of that. I wish I could think of it. And the whole the thing, and to this day, in with my friends, I'm speaking in Spanish, and there's something strange happening, or the family, and somebody said or did said. You both know that, and somebody will just refer to the book. Is oh dear God, I'm getting old. It doesn't come to my mind right now. But if that is a very living thing. Another thing I would like to bring out, that's not as important, is the food, which is this, though it's the same, but it isn't the same. You can, that people have different things. I have for years had a group of different Latin American friends, and we have met a couple of times a month. And people say, well, what did you talk? I said, we talk about food. Nobody can understand anybody, because what Mexicans say, everybody has a different word for corn, and we speak a lot of time arguing about words, no, oh no, this word is this word, but that keeps it alive, and the language is still alive and vital, and I think Americans are always afraid to have another foreign language. And yet in Europe, you have people who, they have three languages. The children speak three languages because that's the country: French, German, Italian, and that's the way it goes. And so you have to know them three, and nobody thinks anything funny of that, of being bilingual or trilingual. But here the language taught not efficiently. You're not going to learn a foreign language in 2 years in high school.
Yeah.
And my grandchildren, the ones in California, their mother was very committed that they would learn Spanish, and they do pretty well.
Yeah.
Not completely, fully, but they do pretty well. My other grandchildren, even though my son's English is, my son's Spanish is very, but his wife actually does much better, and she has no Latin blood.
I just want to highlight something that Conchita just mentioned, which is when we think about the diversity and the heterogeneity of all these peoples that we lump under the term Hispanic, like it practically renders the term Hispanic meaningless. Like it's meaningless. We always tend to see this around like election time, right? When people talk about what did the Hispanic vote do? And it's like, that doesn't tell us anything, because this is such a diverse group of people that come from all sorts of different places, who live in all sorts of different places in the US. So I get why it works as like a unifying term, but I love what Conchita mentioned about when she gets with her friends to talk about food, or even the differences in language. The Mexican Spanish is radically different from Colombian Spanish versus Puerto Riqueño Spanish or Dominicans. So the differences are there. It's just something happens when you cross the borders into the United States, where you all become lumped into this term that is Hispanic or Latino. So
tell you about Hispanic. I remember when that word appeared. I said, what is this Hispanic thing? I'm old enough that I remember things you don't know. That was invented by a newspaper man in New York.
Yeah.
Nobody ever heard of the word Hispanic. And suddenly, that was a word in the newspapers. this, and at the time, I knew, I'm pretty sure it was the New York Times, but I knew this word was invented. Nobody used it. The people, if they call themselves, they would say Latinos or Mexicano or Dominicano or Puerto Riqueño or whatever. But they saw themselves that way. I just remember that, and when I saw that here in that paper, I said, "Oh, here we go again."
It's a government term. Like it was developed by the folks who were trying to think of how to describe us for a census, and I think the 1980 census might have been the first time where it officially became referred to as Hispanic. But the word Latino goes back to the 19th century for the independence wars. There's always going to be a struggle over how to define oneself, right? And I think it's good to keep broadening these terms. And it's good to let people identify how they want to identify themselves, right? So the whole debate over like Latinx, right? And it's just all these identity, it's struggle over how people want to define themselves, right? And for me, that's why I started off by saying that Hispanic is almost like a meaningless term if we consider the vast heterogeneity and diversity of all these peoples, all these historical experiences, all these reasons that when they come into the US, they get flattened into one category. And I think we need to start maybe by unpacking that and thinking about the diversity of these populations in a variety of different ways. It's something as enjoyable as thinking about food to something more serious about thinking about, the impact of US foreign policy in different parts of Latin America.
Alex, you've been quoting all these people and all these books. Could I have a list?
Yeah. Nice to meet you, Conchita. It was my pleasure.
Gusto, Alejandro?
Fue todo mi gusto.
Okay.
Adios.
I mean, you were very...
And I think to myself,